In the summer of 1940, a young RAF pilot opened the hatch of his Whitley bomber over the Ruhr and dropped a package tied with twine. Inside, there were no bombs. There was paper. Millions of sheets printed with messages for the German population. Some aviators, exhausted by the cold at 12,000 meters of altitude, threw the packages without cutting their twine. Projectiles of compact paper at 300 kilometers per hour. That was the air war in 1939. A year later, the same force would drop 450 tons of incendiary bombs on entire cities with the scientifically calculated intention of creating a hell that could not be extinguished. 6 years. 600,000 people dead under the bombs in Europe. Cities reduced to rubble that would take decades to disappear. And even today, when you walk through the reconstructed historic centers of Hamburg, Dresden, or Cologne, there is something in the design that is too clean, too neat to be ancient. This is the story of the deadliest war ever fought in the sky. Before continuing, I want to show you something that I think is especially worthwhile if you are a true World War II enthusiast. Over the past few months, we have been working on a collection dedicated exclusively to one of the most impressive episodes of the conflict, the Battle of Berlin in 1945. We have brought together more than 200 historical photographs, unpublished or very rarely seen, organized in a photographic collection that allows you to visually retrace the last days of the Third Reich. It's not just the same images that appear over and over again in documentaries. We've looked for lesser-known photographs showing the streets of Berlin, soldiers, vehicles, destroyed buildings, and scenes captured during those decisive days in 1945. The origin of an idea, the bomb born in the Balkans. The first modern aerial bomb in history has a known inventor and a precise date. On October 16, 1912, Bulgarian Army Captain Simeon Petrov adapted a series of grenades to be dropped from an Albatros F-2 biplane piloted by Radul Milkov onto a Turkish railway station during the First Balkan War. Petrov later modified the design by adding a stabilizing tail and an impact fuse. The resulting 6-kilogram bomb became standard equipment for the Bulgarian army until 1918, and the blueprints for the so-called Chatalja device were later transferred to Germany, Bulgaria's ally during the First World War. An invention born in the Balkans to destroy a railway station would return 3 decades later to destroy Bulgaria from the air. The seed of aerial warfare was planted. What took time to grow was the theory that turned it into a strategic weapon. In 1921, Italian General Giulio Douhet published Il Dominio dell'Aria, known in English as the Command of the Air. Douhet was an artilleryman by training and had commanded one of the Italian Army's first aviation units. The experience of the trenches of the First World War, that motionless horror that cost millions of lives without moving the front barely a few kilometers, convinced him that the future of warfare lay above. The airplane, he argued, could leap over armies and directly attack the heart of the enemy, its cities, its industries, its will to resist. Douhet went further than any other strategist of his era. He proposed that modern warfare should begin with an immediate and massive attack on enemy cities using a combination of explosive bombs, incendiaries, and chemical agents. The stated goal was to terrorize the civilian population to the point that the government would be forced to surrender before its armies could mobilize. It was brutal in its honesty. The distinction between combatants and civilians, he said, had become irrelevant in modern warfare. Duhay's theory was not immediately popular in all European general staffs, but his ideas quickly permeated Anglo-Saxon military thinking. In Great Britain, Air Marshal Hugh Trenchard, known as the father of the RAF, adopted similar postulates, though with an emphasis on industrial targets rather than pure terror. In the 1930s, the British Air Ministry developed a series of plans known as the Western Air Plans, among which WA5 foresaw attacks against the German industrial economy, especially the Ruhr district. These plans were ambitious on paper. In practice, the force capable of executing them did not yet exist. At the late 1930s, the Royal Air Force had 488 bombers of all types. Many were obsolete. Standard 250 and 500-pound bombs had an explosive charge ratio that hovered around only 25% of the total weight, much lower than equivalent German bombs, which doubled that ratio by adding aluminum powder. Navigation systems were primitive. Pilots and navigators learned celestial navigation, observing stars, to find their way over Germany in the darkness. How much of that would work in practice under real combat conditions no one had tested yet. In Germany, the process was different. The Luftwaffe, secretly rebuilt since 1933 and publicly declared in 1935 in direct defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, had learned aerial warfare in real combat during the Spanish Civil War and Japan's China campaign. Its doctrine was tactical, oriented towards supporting ground operations, medium-range bombers coordinated with armor and artillery. Ernst Udet, the First World War ace who directed the technical development of the Luftwaffe, became infatuated with dive bombing after seeing a display of US Navy aircraft in 1933. The result was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the acoustic symbol of the Blitzkrieg, with its alarm siren designed to terrorize enemy troops on the ground. The Luftwaffe built a force to win quick battles. The RAF built a force, in theory, to win a long war by attacking the enemy economy. Neither was fully prepared for what began on September 1st, 1939. That same day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent a letter to the main European powers involved in the Polish crisis, requesting that they publicly commit to not bombing cities or civilian populations. Hitler responded to the American chargé d'affaires in Berlin that this had always been his criteria. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain did the same. The Poles, whose territory was already burning, agreed that their pilots would respect the same restrictions as long as the enemy did the same. None of those commitments had legal force in international law, and none would last. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Bomber Command in its early years. The RAF Bomber Command was created in 1936 as a result of a reorganization of the air arm. It was headquartered in High Wycombe, northwest of London, and its structure was that of a purely offensive force. All bomber squadrons were under a centralized command, unlike the German Luftwaffe, which distributed its units among different air fleets, and its sole function was to bomb. The command was, by definition, an organization dedicated to defining what to attack, developing the technology to destroy it, and training the personnel to do so. When Bomber Command entered the war in the autumn of 1939, its commander-in-chief was Air Marshal Edgar Ludlow Hewitt. He was a man perfectly aware of the limitations of his force. There were too few airfields capable of operating heavy aircraft. Bomber training was insufficient. Maps of northwestern Germany were missing, and the aircraft fleet was, in polite terms, heterogeneous. Light bombers included the Fairey Battle, a 1933 monoplane that was already obsolete in 1939, and the Bristol Blenheim 4 with limited range and minimal bomb load. The so-called heavy bombers of the period, actually medium by any wartime standard, were three: the Vickers Wellington, the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, and the Handley Page Hampton. The Whitley, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs 800 kilometers away. and had a maximum speed of 357 kilometers per hour. The Wellington, the most successful of the trio, could carry 4,500 pounds of bombs at a maximum speed of 400 kilometers per hour. Its geodetic construction, a lattice-frame fuselage, made it exceptionally robust. But all these aircraft lacked electronic navigation aids comparable to German systems, sufficient defensive armament to resist fighter attacks, and bombs with real destructive power. The political restrictions of the first few months were brutal for the command's morale. With the exception of attacks against naval targets and a few points on the North Sea coast, Bomber Command was confined to flying over Germany, dropping thousands of leaflets, propaganda flights, missions that lasted hours in temperatures of 40 degrees below zero, crossing the North Sea in the dark to drop pamphlets that in many cases no one would pick up. Some aviators, exhausted and furious, threw the bundles without cutting the twine. That way, at least they had some chance of hurting someone. Otherwise, the few combat operations were disastrous. On September 4, 1939, a small attack against the German coast cost 23% of the attacking force. On September 29th, a raid by Hampton bombers over Heligoland ended with the loss of half of the aircraft sent. In October, the Air Ministry ordered that heavy bombers operate primarily at night. Darkness offered protection, but at the cost of making it almost impossible to find and attack specific targets. In March 1940, the Chiefs of Staff concluded that Bomber Command was too weak and unprepared to do anything effective in the foreseeable future. When the German offensive against the West arrived on May 10, 1940, everything changed. That was also the day Neville Chamberlain's government fell and was replaced by one headed by Winston Churchill. Churchill had no moral or legal qualms about using bombers against targets in civilian areas. As Minister of Munitions in 1917, he had been an enthusiastic advocate of long-range airstrikes on Germany. As Air Minister after the war, he had played a key role in securing the independent future of the RAF. His arrival to power was the signal that the Chiefs of Bomber Command were waiting for. On the night of May 11 to 12, 1940, 2 days after the start of the German invasion in the West, and 1 day after Churchill took power, 37 medium and light bombers attacked industrial and transport targets in the Rhenish city of Mönchengladbach. 4 people died, including an English citizen living there. The international embargo agreed upon in September 1939 was over. On May 15th, the War Cabinet made the formal decision to approve a strategy of full bombing against German targets where civilian casualties could occur, provided they were appropriate military targets. On the night of May 15th to 16th, 99 medium bombers attacked targets scattered across the Ruhr. It was the beginning of an offensive that would not end until May 1945. But the beginning is a misleading word. What followed in the summer of 1940 was a demonstration of what a command, prepared doctrinally but not technically, could do. The results were humiliating. A photographic study of the attacks against the German aircraft industry in July 1940 showed that out of 10 attacks, only a couple of hangars had been destroyed. Out of 31 bombed oil installations, only 1 appeared damaged. An American witness who observed an RAF attempt to bomb a Daimler-Benz factory in Stuttgart described how the pilots circled for half an hour over the city trying to identify the target. And then none of the bombs they finally dropped hit the plant. A Bomber Command pilot later wrote that precise targets in the summer of 1940 were useless when the crews could not even find the city they were supposedly attacking. Most RAF bombs fell in the German countryside. Even those deliberately aimed at forests, Churchill had repeatedly pushed to try to set German forests on fire and force a food crisis, failed to start a fire. Experiments with forest or crop fires continued for over a year, until it was finally admitted that even under ideal weather conditions, most incendiaries burned only the few centimeters around the point of impact. Meanwhile, German defenses were relatively weak. Between June and August 1940, German anti-aircraft artillery did not shoot down a single Bomber Command aircraft. Its main effect was to force the attackers to fly higher, scattering the impact points even further. Most of Bomber Command's problems were self-inflicted: forces too small, weaponry incapable of causing significant damage, impossibility of finding the targets. But two factors kept the offensive alive. The first was Charles Portal, the new Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command since April 1940, replacing Ludlow Hewitt. Portal was a discreet and competent career officer, honest and free from prejudice, according to a former colleague. Very little small talk, according to another, who was deeply convinced that bombing would eventually produce decisive strategic results. He jealously guarded his command from external criticism and pressure. In October 1940, he was appointed Chief of the Air Staff, and from that position he protected Bomber Command for years. The second factor was Churchill. In July 1940, he wrote to the Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, describing his vision of how bombing could decisively help overthrow Hitler. But there is one thing that will bring him back and bring him down, and that is an absolutely devastating, exterminating attack by very heavy bombers from this country upon the Nazi homeland. The choice of words was unfortunate and has contributed to the subsequent debate over whether the bombing campaign had a genocidal purpose from its inception. What is almost certain is that Churchill did not think so. He wrote the letter months before the German Blitz began. But he did express his desperate hope that bombing could, as the RAF chiefs had repeatedly claimed, be a means to force Hitler to abandon his invasion plans. On September 7, 1940, Hitler finally authorized a campaign against London and other British cities. The German Blitz had begun. And although it was slow to be admitted, the RAF had provoked that response with its own attacks during the summer. Learning from the enemy, the Blitz and the science of fire. The German Blitz over Great Britain between September 1940 and May 1941 was, in many ways, the school from which Bomber Command drew its most important lessons. Not in the sense that the Germans taught the world how to terrorize the population. That did not work in London nor later in Hamburg, but because the German attacks could be analyzed with scientific precision on the ground. The Germans attacked in formations of hundreds of bombers concentrated over a single target. They used incendiaries intensively, preceded and followed by high explosive bombs to collapse structures, open roofs, and hinder the work of emergency crews. The combined effect produced massive fires that in some cases overwhelmed the capacity of the fire services. In September 1940, the Research and Experiments Department of the British Ministry of Home Security published a detailed study on the effects of German bombs on different types of targets: oil storage, gas plants, power stations, aircraft factories, and reached a conclusion that would have enormous consequences. It is axiomatic that fire will always be the optimum agent for the complete destruction of buildings, factories, etc. The department recommended using high explosive bombs to create the necessary draft conditions in damaged buildings, followed by heavy loads of incendiaries, completed with more high explosive to hinder the enemy's emergency services. It was the seed of area bombing. In parallel, scientist J.D. Bernal directed trials at the Porton Down Experimental Station in Wiltshire, using models of urban areas to study how wind can turn a controllable conflagration into a firestorm. The RAF Photographic Interpretation section provided night photographs to identify the factors that accelerated the spread of fire. Émigré German architects, including Bauhaus founder Walter Gropius, were recruited to confirm details of typical construction in northwestern Germany. Average thicknesses of wooden beams, penetrating power of standard 4-pound incendiary bombs, density of floors. The conclusion of all these studies was formulated with sinister clarity in an Air Ministry report: a German house will burn well. In the United States, parallel work was progressing in the same direction. Boris Laming, the leading American expert on fires in foreign countries, submitted a report in December 1942 concluding that the only way to start a large conflagration under the prevailing conditions in Germany was to simultaneously start many small fires across long strips of urban territory on a day with reasonable wind and low humidity. In the Chemical Warfare Service depots in Utah, experiments were conducted burning different types of structures. In New Jersey, the penetration of different incendiary bomb models was tested on simulated roofs of German construction. Horatio Bond, chief engineer of the National Fire Protection Association, spent 4 months in London in late 1942 advising on large-scale destruction through fire. This research was pure applied science. Its aims were industrial, and its object was a city. On February 14, 1942, the Air Ministry issued a new directive to Bomber Command. Since research had shown that precise attacks against specific targets produced insignificant results, and since aerial photography confirmed that crews could not find their targets, the directive authorized concentrating attacks on the morale of the enemy civil population and in particular of the industrial workers. The built-up areas of German cities were the target. Area bombing had arrived. To command this new offensive, the Air Ministry chose Air Marshal Arthur Travers Harris. Harris took command of Bomber Command on February 22, 1942. He was 50 years old, harsh-voiced, directly cruel in his judgments, and possessed a determination bordering on fanaticism. His subordinates called him Bomber Harris. His detractors called him Butcher Harris. He preferred to ignore both nicknames and dedicate himself to building the force that, he believed with unshakable certainty, could win the war on its own. If Germany had to endure what Great Britain did, Harris repeatedly argued, she would have capitulated much sooner. It was an assertion that conveniently ignored the evidence that Great Britain had not capitulated during the Blitz. But Harris was not a man to be disturbed by uncomfortable evidence. His first major demonstration was on the night of May 30th to 31st, 1942, the first 1,000-bomber raid in history. The target was Cologne. To gather that round number, Harris had to scrape the bottom of available resources, including aircraft and crews from training units. Of the 1,046 bombers dispatched, 890 reached the city and dropped 1,455 tons of bombs in 90 minutes. 41 planes were shot down, 3,800 buildings were destroyed, and another 59,000 damaged. 477 people died. 145,000 were left homeless. Harris presented the attack as the definitive proof that massive bombing was viable. The impact on the British public and the press was immense. In Parliament, Prime Minister Churchill described the raid as a demonstration of the power of air power. What was not said in those praises was the following. During the same period, the German armaments industry continued to grow. Minister Albert Speer reorganized the war economy with an efficiency that more than compensated for the damage caused by the bombings. And the Germans, far from collapsing morally, responded to the attacks with a discipline and an adaptability that baffled those who had predicted a collapse. The Great Debate. The Allies sit in Casablanca. At noon on January 18, 1943, Air Vice Marshal John Slessor, Assistant Chief of the Air Staff of the RAF, was sitting on the roof of the Anfa Hotel in Casablanca, contemplating the long waves of the Atlantic breaking on the beaches, while sketching a compromise agreement between the American and British staffs on the future of Allied strategy. Marshal Portal read the notes, changed a few words, and what Slessor had scribbled in his notebook became, after several days of meetings, the basis of the Casablanca Directive, the mandate for a combined Anglo-American bomber offensive against Germany. The Casablanca Conference, January 14th to 24th, 1943, came at a critical moment. Stalin had declined to attend. He was too busy with the Battle of Stalingrad, and discussions focused on Western strategy. For the bomber forces, the moment was decisive. They had to defend their independent strategy before an increasingly skeptical audience. Churchill had been expressing impatience with Bomber Command for months, and General Arnold, head of the United States Army Air Forces, was under constant pressure to prove that his bombers in Great Britain served some concrete purpose. The problem was the following. The RAF and the USAAF had completely different visions of what strategic bombing was and what it was for. Bomber Command under Harris had adopted area bombing as a principle. Massive night attacks against the residential and commercial areas of German cities, with the aim of destroying housing, demoralizing the working population, and reducing industrial production. Harris did not believe in precise targets. He did not believe his crews could find them at night, nor did he believe that the destruction of specific facilities was strategically more valuable than the general destruction of an industrial city. The United States Army Air Forces, headquartered in Great Britain under the command of General Ira Eaker, had a radically different doctrine. They believed in daylight precision bombing, formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators attacking specific targets in broad daylight, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, aircraft factories, using the advanced Norden bombsight. The theory was that destroying critical bottlenecks in German industry would collapse the war economy without the need to raze entire cities. At Casablanca, there was an additional debate that almost destroyed the collaboration. Churchill wanted the Americans to abandon daylight bombing and switch to night operations under RAF command. He considered flying by day over Germany an invitation to disaster. General Eaker personally flew to Morocco to meet with Churchill and present him with a single page of arguments in favor of daylight bombing. When Churchill read the document aloud and reached the sentence about attacks around the clock, according to Eaker himself, he savored the words as if they were delicious morsels. By the next day, Churchill had agreed to give daylight bombing a provisional chance. The Casablanca Directive, document CCS 166 approved on January 21, 1943, was intentionally vague, a set of hopeful intentions rather than a clear plan. Its stated goal was to destroy and dislocate the German military, industrial and economic system and to undermine the morale of the German people to the point where their capacity for resistance would be fatally weakened. The document left each air force considerable freedom to interpret how to achieve this. Harris read in it what he wanted to see, a license to continue destroying cities. Eaker read the opposite, the justification for a precision campaign against industrial targets. Broadly speaking, both readings were correct, and that meant that the combined offensive would remain in practice two separate campaigns conducted in parallel. On January 27, 1943, 3 days after the end of the conference, 59 bombers from the 8th Air Force attacked the port of Wilhelmshaven. It was the first American attack on German territory. The Allied bombing campaign over Germany was officially underway. The Hell of Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah. In November 1941, the Directorate of Bomber Operations of the British Air Ministry concluded, after a study of urban targets in northern Germany, that Hamburg presented the best general conditions for a large-scale incendiary attack. The city was large, the second largest in the Reich. Its vulnerability to fire was outstanding, and its proximity to British air bases made it reachable with substantial bomb loads. In February 1942, a detailed technical memorandum was prepared on how to start a large-scale conflagration in Hamburg. The working-class neighborhood north of the Elbe was the most densely built sector, and therefore the most vulnerable. In February 1943, emigrated German architects advising the ministry's RE8 team confirmed that the typical working-class housing structures in northwestern Germany, brick terraced houses from the 19th and 20th centuries with wooden floors and slate roofs, burned exceptionally well. On May 27, 1943, Arthur Harris made the decision. Hamburg would be the next primary target. The operation would receive the codename Gomorrah. For the attack, Bomber Command had a new weapon, the window, known in German as Düppel and in English as window. It was a simple electronic countermeasures technique. Strips of aluminized paper 30 centimeters long designed to create a blizzard of false echoes on German defense radars. The idea had been developed in late 1941 at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, but its use had been postponed for months for fear that the Germans would adopt the same technique against British radar. By July 1943, Great Britain's air defences had been sufficiently modernised, and Churchill approved its use in Operation Gomorrah on July 15th. On the night of July 24th to 25th, 1943, 728 bombers took off for northern Germany. 80 kilometres from the target, the crews began dropping bundles of window strips at a rate of 1 per minute. German radar screens filled with a snowfall of false echoes. German night fighters, directed from the ground via the Himmelbett system, lost their targets. Searchlights and anti-aircraft artillery had to improvise a blind barrage. In less than an hour, 2,284 tons of bombs fell on Hamburg, including an average of 17,000 incendiaries per square kilometre. 10,289 people died, 3 times more than in any previous attack. But the worst was yet to come. The final week of July 1943 had been exceptionally dry and hot in northern Germany. On July 27th, the temperature reached 32 degrees Celsius and the relative humidity dropped to 30%, an abnormally low level for the time of year. The lack of rain for days had dried out the wood of the buildings and accumulated combustible materials in courtyards and attics. On the night of July 27th to 28th, 729 bombers attacked again. The Pathfinders, the force's guiding unit, dropped their markers several kilometers east of the center of Hamburg, but the mainstream of the force concentrated its 2,326 tons of bombs, approximately half incendiary, half high explosive, over the densely built working-class neighborhoods of Hammerbrook, Borgfelder, Hamm, Billwerder, Hohenfelder, and Rothenburgsort. The attack lasted just over an hour. But what it unleashed could not be extinguished. The city's water utilities had been damaged in the previous raid. Emergency crews were still working on the fires in the west. When the thousands of small fires started by the incendiaries began to merge into a single blazing mass, there was no longer any way to stop them. The Hamburg police president described what followed as a hurricane of fire against which all human resistance seemed vain. The illusion of a hurricane had a real physical basis. The scale and intense heat of the conflagration generated a column of hot air that rose rapidly more than 3 kilometers above the city. The vacuum it left as it rose drew in cold air from the surroundings with a force that reached hurricane velocities in the fire zone. Trees uprooted, buildings collapsed, human bodies sucked into the flames where they were incinerated or mummified within minutes. Temperatures in the fire zone exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. In the thousands of basements and shelters, oxygen was sucked upward, and survivors who had sought protection underground slowly died of carbon monoxide poisoning. 18,474 people died that night. An area of more than 12 square kilometers was scorched. But Harris was not finished. 2 more raids on July 29th and 30th and August 2nd completed what he called the destruction of Hamburg. The cumulative total calculated by local police authorities in November 1943 was 31,647 dead, revised upward in May 1944 to 38,975, close to the today accepted figure of approximately 37,000. 900,000 people left the city. 61% of Hamburg's houses and apartments were destroyed or damaged, along with 580 industrial installations and 2,632 businesses. Bomber Command lost 87 aircraft in the entire operation, 2.5% of the sorties flown, the lowest loss rate on such a scale of attack. The consequences for the German air defense system were profound. The Hamburg catastrophe accelerated the abandonment of the fixed defense represented by the Kamm-Huber line, a chain of defensive sectors with coordinated radars and night fighters, in favor of more flexible tactics. General Josef Kamm-Huber lost his post in November 1943. Minister Albert Speer personally visited the ruins and stated that if the Allies carried out another 6 similar attacks in different cities, he might be forced to halt armaments production. The Allies did not succeed. Why they did not is a central part of this story. The Daylight Battle. The Americans over Germany. While Harris consumed cities by night, the American 8th Air Force fought a completely different battle in broad daylight, and it was losing. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing rested on one premise: that compact formations of B-17 flying fortresses with their defensive armament of .50 caliber machine guns could penetrate German airspace without fighter escort and reach their targets with sufficient accuracy to destroy them. It was a theory developed in the controlled environment of pre-war exercises, never tested in actual combat. When the 8th Air Force began attacking targets inside Germany in the fall of 1943, the theory crumbled. On August 17, 1943, the same date that the Allied conquest of Sicily was completed, 230 B-17 bombers attacked the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and the fighter assembly plants in Regensburg. Schweinfurt produced approximately 50% of Germany's ball bearings, critical components for virtually the entire Reich war machine. Regensburg was the primary factory for the Messerschmitt 109 fighter. The dual operation was designed to saturate German defenses. 60 bombers were shot down. Another 200 returned damaged. Almost 600 American aviators died or became prisoners in a single day. The Schweinfurt plants suffered considerable damage, but returned to production within weeks. The second attack on Schweinfurt, on October 14, 1943, was even more catastrophic. 291 bombers reached the target. 60 were shot down, more than 20% of the force, and 138 returned with damage so severe that they were temporarily out of service. In statistical terms, a crew flying 30 missions over Germany without fighter escort during this period had a survival probability close to zero. The fundamental problem was geographical and technological. The available escort fighters, mainly the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an excellent aircraft with excellent speed and armament, did not have the necessary range to accompany the bombers beyond the borders of Western Germany. Once the Thunderbolts had to turn back, the B-17S were left alone against the German fighters. Luftwaffe pilots had quickly learned that the weak point of American formations was the tail and the belly, where defensive fire was less dense. From his headquarters in Washington, General Henry Arnold, known as Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, watched the numbers with growing alarm. In June 1943, he had sent a telegram to General Eaker telling him that the number of bombers dispatched on each mission is not satisfactory, and demanding that he replace his commanders. It was an unfair criticism. The losses were due to the absence of long-range escort, not tactical incompetence, but it reflected the political pressure weighing on the campaign. The 8th Air Force had to prove that precision bombing worked, and at that moment, it was not proving it. The solution already existed, and no one had sufficiently taken advantage of it. The North American P-51 Mustang had been originally designed in 1940 to fulfill a British order. The RAF used it in its initial versions with an Allison engine with mediocre results, but British engineers mounted a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into the fuselage of the P-51 and completely transformed the aircraft. Higher speed, better service ceiling, superior maneuverability. The news reached Washington through the American Embassy in London, and Arnold immediately saw the potential. In November 1942, he placed an initial order for 2,200 units with Merlin engines manufactured under license in the United States. However, the P-51s entered operational service with the 8th Air Force only in December 1943, and in significant numbers only in the spring of 1944. The P-51, with its additional fuel tanks, could fly to Berlin, 1,000 kilometers away from its bases in England, and back. It was faster than any German fighter at cruise altitude, and in low-level combat, it was superior to the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109. But before the Mustang arrived in strength, the 8th Air Force had to reorganize. In December 1943, Arnold replaced Eaker, notifying him by telegram in a gesture of abruptness that Eaker remembered bitterly for the rest of his life. With General James "Jimmy" Doolittle famous for the bombing raid over Tokyo in April 1942, and an enthusiastic advocate of bomber escort. Along with General Karl Tui Spatz, who took command of all American strategic air forces in Europe, and General William Kepner at the head of Fighter Command, a new team was formed, ready to radically change tactics. The key was simple and completely revolutionary for American doctrine. Escort fighters should not stick to the bombers to protect them. They had to go out, find the German fighters, and destroy them. Kepner ordered his pilots to pursue the Hun until he is destroyed. The new freelance system assigned entire squadrons of fighters to move up to 8 kilometers away from the bomber stream in search of combat. On the return flight, fighters were ordered to fly low to attack German airfields and destroy aircraft on the ground. The trap that the RAF had avoided during the Battle of Britain, ordering fighters to remain glued to the bombers, limiting their tactical effectiveness, was exactly the trap into which the Luftwaffe was falling. The big week: annihilation of the German air industry. The winter of 1943-44 was terrible for the 8th Air Force. The weather was consistently bad over Germany: dense cloud cover, icing, high-altitude winds, and missions were either cancelled or turned into blind attacks that scattered bombs over square kilometers without hitting the designated targets. But the weather also kept German fighters grounded, which reduced American losses, and during this period, Doolittle and Spatz used the weeks of enforced inactivity to complete the reorganization of their forces. On February 19, 1944, the weather finally cleared. In 7 days, from February 20th to 26th, the 8th Air Force launched 6,200 sorties against 18 aircraft assembly plants and 2 ball-bearing factories. The operation was named Argument, though American journalists dubbed it the Big Week. On February 20th, the first day of the operation, 880 bombers attacked 12 major targets in Rostock, Brunswick, Leipzig, and half a dozen smaller cities. Losses were only 15 aircraft, 1.7%, and 4 fighters. As the week progressed and the Luftwaffe understood the pattern of the attacks, losses rose, reaching 158 bombers from the 8th Air Force and 89 from the 15th, which was attacking from Italy without any escort by the end of the operation. But the Luftwaffe lost a third of its single-engine fighters during February and nearly a fifth of its fighter pilots. The impact on production was real but partial. Between January and June 1944, the German industry produced 9,255 single-engine fighters instead of the planned 12,667, a 27% difference. In February, the deficit was 38.5% compared to what had been planned. The dispersion of the aircraft industry throughout the territory of the Reich, accelerated by the attacks themselves, reduced the efficiency of subsequent bombing waves. But the damage to the Luftwaffe's human resources, pilots and mechanics, was much harder to repair. In parallel, Spatz began to push for a target that his economists had recommended to him since February: synthetic oil. Germany produced a significant proportion of its aviation gasoline through synthesis processes from coal. The Fischer-Tropsch plants in Leuna, Pöhlitz, Böhlen and other cities in central and eastern Germany were colossal installations, complex and difficult to conceal or disperse. A committee of 8th Air Force economists had calculated that by attacking these plants, it was possible to force the German army to consume its reserves and bring the war to a breaking point within months. Spatz lobbied for weeks to obtain approval for the attack on oil, facing the preference of other commanders for the transportation plan, attacks against the French railway network in support of the imminent invasion of Normandy. In the meantime, the 15th Air Force from Italy began attacking the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, technically against marshalling yards, but with bombs that deliberately fell on production facilities. Finally, on May 12, 1944, Spatz sent 886 bombers, escorted by 735 fighters, against 6 large oil plants in Germany. The force lost 46 bombers, but American fighters destroyed 65 German planes, with the loss of only 7 of their own. The following day, ultra-intelligence, decrypted German-coded messages at Bletchley Park, revealed an urgent German order moving all available anti-aircraft artillery to protect the synthetic oil plants. It was the confirmation that the blow had hit home. In the following months, German aviation gasoline production plummeted. It had been 180,000 tons in March 1944. By June, it had fallen to 54,000 tons. The Luftwaffe began to limit training, routine flights and patrols to conserve the remaining fuel. Combat in the sky, the Battle of Germany. The expression Battle of Germany was coined by General Frederick Anderson, Spatz's deputy since January 1944, to describe the combat that took place mainly between January and June 1944 over the airspace of the Reich, the struggle for air supremacy that preceded and accompanied the invasion of Normandy. The Germans knew the danger. General Erhard Milch, Göring's deputy at the Air Ministry, had put it bluntly: "The territory of the Reich is more important than the front." Since the fall of 1943, he had pressed for an emergency production of fighters, finally agreed with Albert Speer in the so-called Fighter Staff, Jägerstab, established on March 1, 1944, and for a profound reorganization of air defense. In December 1943, the Air Fleet of the Reich, Luftflotte Reich, was created under the command of Colonel General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, with coordinated responsibility for the entire defensive war against Allied bombers. The German problem was not a lack of aircraft. Between January and June 1944, the German industry produced 9,489 fighters. The problem was that it produced aircraft slower than it lost them. In the period from January to June 1944, Luftwaffe losses on all fronts equaled 137% of its established strength, 6,259 aircraft lost in combat and 3,608 in accidents. But the most revealing arithmetic was in the pilots. The training cycle for a German fighter pilot had dropped from 210 hours in 1942 to 112 hours in 1944. Operational training had been reduced from 50 hours to 20. Novice pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with barely a few hours in the type of aircraft they were supposed to fly. Furthermore, pilots returning from the Eastern Front, accustomed to low-altitude combat in pairs or loose groups of 4, required a difficult adaptation to the type of dogfight with highly trained opponents over Germany. General Joseph Galland, General of Fighters, described the progressive collapse with brutal honesty in his November 1944 memorandum. His pilots attacked in formations of 30, 50, sometimes 60 planes, but each pilot simply attacked at random. Result: every one of them was shot down at random. American tactics had changed radically since the days of Eaker. Doolittle and Kepner had inverted the priority. Escort fighters were no longer supposed to protect the bombers, but to destroy the enemy fighters instead. Where before P-47s flew glued to the formation, losing speed and maneuverability, they now went ahead to the sides, above and below in groups of 4, free to attack any German target they encountered. On the return flight, pilots dropped to ground level to strafe airfields, trains, convoys, anything that moved with a black cross. A captured German pilot, a wing commander, described the situation to his interrogators. "When we arrived in large numbers, it was total confusion. Each pilot attacked on his own without coordination. The Americans surrounded us, separated us, and shot us down one by one." Heinz Nocker, one of the surviving German pilots, published after the war a vivid combat diary that described the daily nightmare of the spring of 1944. In a single day, he was hit twice, saw both pilots on his flank shot down, and had to request a borrowed third replacement aircraft which was destroyed on the ground during a low-level attack. By nightfall, he remained in the crew room with only one other pilot from his squadron. The statistics reflect that carnage. In April 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 422 heavy bombers, 25% of the total force. But the Luftwaffe lost 43% of its fighter force in the same month. And while the Americans could replace their losses with the generous flow of planes and pilots crossing the Atlantic, the Germans could not. Allied air supremacy over Germany, a condition unthinkable 3 years prior, was established approximately in June 1944, just as the invasion of Normandy made it more necessary than ever. The Luftwaffe history officer, General of Aviation Hans Detlev von Roden, wrote in a post-war assessment the conclusion that his superiors had been unable to admit Germany had lost the fight for control of the air. Society under the bombs. Germany resists. When American General Frederick Anderson traveled by jeep through the captured areas of Western Germany in the spring of 1945, his diary became a catalogue of the language of devastation. Mainz, a gleaming shell. Darmstadt, a mess. Frankfurt, mostly roofless. Looks like Pompeii magnified. Ludwigshafen, ghastly, fantastic spectacle. Upon reaching the Ruhr, language ran out. Düsseldorf, not even a ghost. The rubble is beginning to all look alike. Cologne, indescribable. You get a feeling of horror. Nothing is left. But how did people live under that hell? The Nazi government had created since 1935 one of the most elaborate civil defense structures in interwar Europe. The Reichsluftschutzbund, the Reich Air Raid Protection League, had 15 million members in 1939, 22 million in 1942, approximately a quarter of the population. Civil protection was a community obligation codified in law. Failure to comply with air defense regulations could lead to fines or imprisonment. The system rested on the concept of Selbstschutz, self-protection. Each apartment block had to have its own defense organization with designated equipment, evacuation routes, and a basement or cellar converted into an air raid shelter room. Each household had to maintain a rope, a fire hose, ladders, a first aid kit, buckets of sand, water reserves, an axe, and a shovel. It was not optional. The Luftschutzwarte, the civilian wardens, had the legal right to conscript neighbors to work in emergencies caused by bombings, even while the attack was still ongoing. But this system, however impressive on paper, had critical limits that the escalation of Allied bombing revealed one by one. Public shelters in 1939–40 were grossly insufficient. In Hamburg in September 1939, there were places in public shelters for 7,000 people out of a population of 1.7 million. In the city of Münster, a likely target for bombers, in April 1940, there were public shelter spaces for 3.3% of the population. Domestic basements, the alternative, were highly variable in quality. Some were extensive cellars under apartment blocks, while others were nothing more than a small storeroom or a hallway. The response of the state was slow and uneven. Areas outside Zone 1, the 94 most threatened industrial cities, received little state funding for protection works. The Air Ministry systematically rejected investment requests for civil defense outside first priority areas. The evacuation of civilians was another weak point. Göring announced in October 1939 that there would be no assisted evacuation from threatened areas. It was not until October 1940, more than a year after the start of the war, and 6 months after the British bombings began, that the first convoys of children left Berlin for the countryside. Even then, the regime preferred to present it as an extension of the countryside holiday program, Kinderlandverschickung, for city children, instead of admitting that the capital was being bombed. The security reports from the Sicherheitsdienst, the internal intelligence service of the SS, revealed a nuanced picture of morale under the bombs. After the first raids in the summer of 1940, the population remained calm, except where the sirens failed to sound. But in the most intensely bombed areas of the Ruhr in 1943, the reports described people as dejected and nervous, with exaggerated rumors of destruction circulating throughout the unbombed area. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, ordered the press to eliminate the word mood to describe public attitudes, which could obviously be highly variable, and to write only about high morale. The Nazi state did achieve several things with remarkable efficiency. Food supplies were maintained until very late in 1945. Essential services were repaired with surprising speed after each raid. The railway network, a high-priority target for the Americans, was sabotaged, damaged, patched up, and restored in cycles that for a long time kept a pace that did not completely compromise the functioning of the system. An important explanation for the mismatch between destruction and expected collapse was offered by Hungarian economist Nicholas Kaldor, a member of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey (USSBS) analysis team. The German economy had a considerable cushion, reserves of productive capacity, labor, raw materials, that could replace what was destroyed by the bombings for a long time before collapse manifested itself. The conquest of most of continental Europe had given it access to immense resources, 119 billion marks in contributions from the occupied territories, 7.9 million forced laborers and prisoners of war inside Germany, and an estimated 20 million working under compulsion in the occupied countries. Only when the American attacks on oil and transportation, begun in earnest in May 1944, simultaneously struck two systems with no cushion for easy replacement, did the collapse begin to become real. Dresden, February 1945. The fire that changed something. On the night of February 13, 1945, the city of Dresden had no air raid alarm system in working condition. The heavy artillery had been transferred to the Eastern Front. The available night fighters had been drawn in another direction by a diversionary raid, and the city was full, completely overwhelmed, with refugees fleeing westward before the advance of the Red Army. Sometimes called the Florence of the Elbe due to its extraordinary architectural heritage, the Zwinger, the Frauenkirche, the Semperoper, kilometers of Baroque in golden sandstone, Dresden was also city number 22 on the British Ministry of Economic Warfare's objective priority list, with a key score of 70 points. Harris had left it alone until then, partly due to its distance from bomber command bases, partly because there was no industry clearly linked to the objectives of the successive bombing plans. The origin of the decision to attack Dresden can be traced back to Churchill. In January 1945, the Premier wrote to the Secretary of State for Air asking if there were plans to bomb Berlin and no doubt other large cities in eastern Germany in support of the Soviet advance. The response from General Norman Bottomley, Deputy Chief of the Air Staff to Marshal Harris, included a list of cities, among them Dresden, Leipzig and Chemnitz. Bottomley himself presented a memorandum to the Chiefs of Staff in which he described the objective in terms of supporting the Soviet advance. The cities of eastern Germany were transit centers for troops and refugees, and their destruction may well result in the establishment of a state of chaos in the German lines. At the Yalta Conference, February 4th to 11th, 1945, the Soviet delegation agreed on a limitation zone in eastern Germany within which both Western and Soviet forces could operate freely. Dresden fell within that zone. On February 8th, Schaeff issued formal operational instructions to Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force to attack the cities of eastern Germany. On the night of February 13th to 14th, 1945, 796 Lancasters from Bomber Command attacked in two successive waves, carrying 2,646 tons of bombs, of which 1,181 tons were incendiaries. The first wave was moderately effective. The second, under conditions of perfect visibility and with the city already marked by the fires from the first, achieved an exceptional concentration over the historic center. The low humidity of a dry winter cold, combined with the exceptional concentration of incendiaries over the wooden urban fabric of the historic center, generated another firestorm. The flames consumed 15 square kilometers of the city, an area larger than the one destroyed in Hamburg. The Dresden Police Service records estimated approximately 25,000 dead, a figure confirmed in 2010 by a historical commission established by the Dresden city authorities. Out of 220,000 homes, 75,000 were destroyed. The following day, the 8th Air Force carried out its first attack on the city's railway marshalling yards, but the smoke from the previous night's fires obscured the target, and 700 tons of bombs destroyed more Dresden streets. In the afternoon, 210 B-17, unable to reach their primary oil target, blindly bombed the city with another 461 tons. In less than 24 hours, nearly 4,000 tons of bombs had fallen on Dresden. 2 days after the raid, an RAF officer at Schaff gave a press conference in which he spoke of deliberately bombing cities to cause panic and destroy morale. Associated Press journalist Howard Cowan transmitted a dispatch that passed Schaff censorship, and by February 18th, the American press was reporting that the Allies had adopted deliberate terror bombing. General Arnold had to mount a campaign to convince the American public that Dresden had been attacked as an important communications center. Goebbels had added an extra zero to the provisional casualty figure and leaked through the neutral press that 250,000 people had died. The Bombing Restriction Committee in London published that figure, sparking a stormy correspondence that accused the committee of acting as a mouthpiece for German propaganda. On March 28, 1945, Churchill sent a memorandum to Portal, his own chief of the air staff, protesting that bombing for the sole purpose of increasing terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. He asked for the focus to shift toward oil and transportation, as foreseen by strategic directives, rather than mere acts of terror and wanton destruction. Harris learned of the document through Bottomley and responded with indignation that the bombing of cities had always been strategically justified because it would shorten the war and save the lives of Allied soldiers. Portal convinced Churchill to moderate the tone of the memorandum for the chiefs of staff. The entire episode, including the dramatic reversal of the man who for years had driven the offensive, is completely missing from the history of the Second World War that Churchill published after the war. Area bombing continued for weeks more, unable to be stopped simply by the change of mood of a prime minister. On February 23rd, Bomber Command attacked the small town of Pforzheim with such precision, dropping bombs from just 2,400 meters of altitude instead of the usual 5,500 to 6,000 over defended targets, that the resulting fire consumed 83% of the urban area and killed an estimated 17,600 people, the third highest death toll in any attack of the war in Europe, though it has never received the attention of Dresden. On March 11th, more than 1,000 bombers dropped 4,661 tons onto the already deserted rubble of Essen, just a few hours before American troops occupied the city. On March 16th to 17th, 1,127 tons of bombs destroyed the small medieval town of Würzburg, killing between 4,000 and 5,000 people and destroying 89% of the city. The aviators received the briefing on the target with a note: the center should make a good fire. The directive that, for the first time since February 1942, did not include industrial areas or morale as specific targets reached Harris on April 16, 1945. 3 weeks later, Germany surrendered. The price, crews, pilots, and the arithmetic of death. 135,000 people flew with Bomber Command throughout the war. 41% of them died. The figure is neither metaphorical nor approximate. It is the one calculated by Marshal Harris himself after the facts, and the one confirmed by Air Ministry records. In absolute terms, 47,268 killed in action or deceased as prisoners of war. Another 8,195 killed in accidents. The total of 55,500 dead, out of combat counting all concepts, represented 54.7% of all RAF fatalities during the war. The majority of that figure belonged to young men between 19 and 25 years old, many of them fresh out of the Commonwealth training system. The largest non-British contingent was Canadian. Of the total number of dead, 9,919 were Canadians who served in Bomber Command. In total, Bomber Command aircraft losses from all causes reached 16,454 planes. American statistics tell a different but equally brutal story. Heavy bomber losses of the 8th Air Force against Germany between 1942 and 1945 totaled 10,152 aircraft. The number of American combat deaths in all European theaters reached 30,099. To contextualize those figures with the realities of individual combat, a Lancaster crew starting its missions in the spring of 1943 and aiming to complete the 25 required to finish a tour of operations, after which they were sent to training units for a period, had a statistical probability of surviving below 30%. The tour was extended to 30 missions, and then the automatic limit for repatriation to the United States was abandoned. During the period of the Battle of Berlin, November 1943 to March 1944, Bomber Command's loss rate was such that new crews mathematically had fewer chances of survival than an infantry officer in the First World War. Aviators lived with that statistic hanging over them. The medical classification of lack of moral fiber, LMF, was applied to 2,726 cases during the war, a small figure compared to the number of those who simply sat in the briefing room night after night, sick with fear, and then climbed into their planes anyway. The condition of the bomber in flight was a physical martyrdom in addition to a psychological one. Heavy bombers flew at altitudes of between 6,000 and 8,000 meters, where outside temperatures reached 45 degrees below zero. Electric flight suits could fail. Gun turrets were exposed to the wind. Oxygen systems could freeze or run out. A pilot who turned his head too sharply could lose consciousness. In the target area, planes had to fly straight and level during the bomb run, 30 seconds to a minute, while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky and night fighters tried to get close enough to shoot. And after all that, they had to find their way back home through hundreds of kilometers of darkness. American General Doolittle wrote in a note to Arnold in the summer of 1944, "The crew with enough fuel to land at another base are not heroes. They are workers who have completed an extraordinarily demanding day's work. That is the standard of the ordinary in this command." The final balance. What did the bombing achieve? In August 1944, General Spaatz asked his commanders to accelerate Germany's defeat and surrender so that a special committee could review what the bombing had achieved in Europe and apply those conclusions to the war against Japan. The idea for a serious scientific analysis of the campaign had emerged in the spring of 1944, and with Arnold's enthusiastic support, it ended up becoming the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, USSBS, formally established on November 3, 1944. It was headed by Franklin de Ollier, president of the Prudential Life Insurance Company, and included 300 civilians and 850 military personnel. Its conclusions, based on hundreds of reports and interrogations of the main captured German leaders, were devastating for certain conceptions of air warfare. Hermann Göring, interrogated on May 10, 1945 at the Augsburg Riding School, was direct. When asked whether precision or area bombing was more effective in defeating Germany, he answered without hesitation, "Precision, because it was decisive." Destroyed cities, area attacks on cities had had the least strategic impact. The person in charge of the economic analysis of the USSBS, Hungarian economist Nicholas Kaldor, calculated that, tripling between 1941 and 1944, the net effect was to slow down the rate of growth, not to stop it. The USSBS General Report was specific about the three factors that did work: the defeat of the Luftwaffe over Germany, the attacks on synthetic oil, and the attacks on the railway transportation network. The scope of the first point deserves emphasis. The battle for air supremacy over the Reich, what Anderson called the Battle of Germany, was not just the precondition for bombers to be able to attack with fewer losses. It was, in itself, one of the most significant military victories of the war. It forced the Luftwaffe to withdraw 81% of its fighters to the Western Front to defend the interior of the Reich in October 1944, leaving the Eastern and Mediterranean fronts without adequate air protection at critical moments of the ground war. The Reich's anti-aircraft service absorbed 889,000 people in 1944, consumed a fifth of all German ammunition, half of the electronics industry's production, and a third of all optical equipment. These were resources that did not fight in Russia, did not land in Normandy, did not defend the Mediterranean. The attacks on oil, which began in earnest on May 12, 1944, reduced German aviation gasoline production from 180,000 monthly tons in March 1944 to 54,000 in June, and to even lower values afterward. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had an excess of pilots and aircraft that it could not fly due to a lack of fuel. The attacks on transportation, favored by General Tedder and scientist Solly Zuckerman, ensured that by November 1944, the German railway had only 11 days of coal reserves, and by December barely 5. Total railway traffic dropped 46% between September 1944 and January 1945. The Mittelland Canal, the main communication route between the Ruhr and central Germany, was rendered useless for weeks. The Reich's economy began to collapse due to a lack of flow, not a lack of capacity. But the most uncomfortable question of the final balance is not what worked, but what was not necessary. Between September 1944 and May 1945, the last 8 months of the war, Bomber Command, the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force combined, dropped 3/4 of the entire war's bomb tonnage against a Germany whose capacity to resist was already clearly waning. During this period, approximately half of all Germans who would perish under the bombs during the entire war died. Bomber Command in its final weeks attacked small cities that had never been major targets: Würzburg, Pforzheim, Hildesheim, Paderborn. Some had railway yards or small industrial plants. Many were simply cities that had not yet been destroyed. The area directive had returned in its twilight to being what it had always been: the destruction of cities for the sake of destruction itself, with strategic arguments that sounded more and more like post hoc justifications. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith, part of the USSBS team, later wrote in his memoirs that the man-hours, aircraft and bombs invested in the bombing campaign had cost the American economy more production than they had cost Germany. It was a debatable claim in its details, but it pointed to a deeper truth. The air war was not a tool of surgical precision. It was a colossal, partially blind force that took years to learn where to direct its destructive energy. And in that learning time, it killed hundreds of thousands of people who lived in the wrong cities.